Hello and welcome to this episode of the Navigating Risk podcast with me, Luca Rosi, Deputy Editor Global Content at Gallagher. In this action-packed episode, we speak to Chris Andrew, Communication Consulting Lead at Gallagher. Chris delves into the findings of our recently published Employee Communications Report, talking to us about how organisations can navigate a comms landscape dominated by change. Chris, welcome to the Navigating Risks podcast. Really good to have you on today to talk about the state of the sector survey findings. Can we just start off with the readiness gap, which is obviously the key sort of theme in the report? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Thanks, Luca. So I'm Chris Andrew. I lead strategic planning and communication consulting at Gallagher in the global communications practice. I've got a background in marketing, communications, and driving sustainable behavioural change. My focus is really helping organisations to connect with their people in ways that truly matter in order to drive organisational performance. Delighted to be part of the report this year. 18 years strong, so where the report is now old enough to go for a drink, which is wonderful. So congratulations to the report. But it is a very well respected and very well established report, and looking after it as an editor this year has been a real privilege. Every year there is a theme. Last year was really focused around constant change, and that hasn't gone away. If anything, it's really accelerated, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as we go. But really based on that world and the idea of constant change being an ongoing risk, the focus that we really wanted to look at with the report this year was to what extent are organizations set up in the background in order to make sure that they can respond to an uncertain world as effectively as they possibly can. And there is, in 2025 clearly was marked the end of an era where change communication and change management could be treated as a discrete skill set. And then today, navigating volatility is the baseline for the majority of our roles, and that change is a constant. Yet, as our research shows, this widening readiness gap exists between the perceived risks within an organization and having the capabilities and the structure needed to navigate those risks and meet the true demand of the organization. And the risks are significant. I mean, as we see in the report, some of the risks that came top of the list were line manager capability, which was 87% of people said that was a significant or moderate risk. We had information overload at 83% of people thought that, and employee burnout at 81%. So whilst that sounds a little bit doom and gloom, what we were wanting to do was ensure that these elements are impacted by change, the communication of change, the way in which organizations manage communication and drive culture and drive performance and so on and so forth. So the readiness gap is really around our view of what are the supporting elements that can enable you to be ready for what is going to come next, even if you don't know exactly what that looks like.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. And what should organisations, in your view, be focusing on? What should they be really honing in on in 2026 and beyond?
Well, I mean, the report focuses on a number of different areas that really came out as being the biggest challenges. So we saw that, for example, change as a skill, change communication and change management was cited as being the most important skill for now and into the future. Yet 2/3 of organizations that we spoke to aren't necessarily providing training and skills to enable that to happen. So there is a big challenge when it comes to sort of moving away from change and transformation as big project focused and it being more business as usual. And then actually the focus being more on enabling employees and managers to be more resilient and to be able to live in a world of constant change. So that seems to be a real kind of focus area. The other areas that we've looked at, and I'm sure that we'll come on to in a bit more detail, is around his line manager capability element. So, and this comes up year on year as being a challenge. And the challenge is that there's no silver bullet to fix this line manager capability gap. The reality is that line managers as well, and I think it's really important that line managers shouldn't be seen as one big group of people. There are multiple personas and scenarios based on whether you're in a desk-based workforce versus a frontline workforce, location, role, whether people have come into that role intentionally to be a people manager, or actually more often than not, they become people managers because they were very good at doing their job and then as a result became a people manager following that, but aren't necessarily having the opportunity to grow the skills and the confidence and the capability to be effective communicators and effective line managers. And that is a challenge that not necessarily is within the sphere of influence of HR, and sometimes not within the sphere of internal communications. It's really a leadership area where we need to help to educate the importance of providing that space to be able to ensure that managers can communicate with confidence. And I think most importantly, context. I think in the challenge that we have with lots of communication, and we'll come onto it perhaps a little bit later, is around the importance of being able to personalize and make communications relevant. People are feeling burnt out. They are getting too much information. There's too much change. And a big piece to mitigate that risk is about personalizing, simplifying, and streamlining communication so that what those employees do receive is absolutely targeted and tailored to them as an individual. Now, digital can do that to an extent, but digital platforms can only do that if they've got the data to provide that support, and that data is robust and multifaceted. And it's not just thinking about role and location, but it's actually thinking about, does this employee have caring responsibilities outside of their day-to-day role? Have they just come into this business through a merger, a merger partner, or whatever it might be? These are nuances that we need to consider the sort of the human behind the employee in terms of how they respond to those kinds of communications. So there's a big piece around line management, and the other bit that really came out from the data is about AI and AI adoption and usage, and that's one of the key areas where we were perhaps a little bit surprised that the majority of people that we spoke to in the report, 1,300 respondents from across the globe, were really focused on 75% on really ad hoc experimentation of AI tools. So using it for simple tasks like summarizing meetings or writing a draft of an email, rather than some of the more sophisticated, complex use cases that AI is capable of. And the reasons behind that, again, are not straightforward. It may be about leadership visibility. It might be about access to technology, but it seems that it's, from the research that we've done, it's less about access to technology and it's more about having the governance and guardrails in place. What was really interesting is that 75% number in terms of being in experimentation mode. What we also saw was that confidence in AI and people who felt that they were AI ready doubled, where there were sort of better socialized guardrails and governance in place and leadership buy-in. So in comparison to lots of other areas where perhaps sometimes guidelines and rules can have a negative impact on adoption, when it comes to AI, it's actually the opposite, which I think is interesting, but there's a lot more to unpack there, I think.
No, thanks, Chris. A lot of things to unpick there. Can I perhaps just rewind a little bit and go back to the line manager issue that you were talking about, which is obviously linked to employee burnout, isn't it? Because obviously managers are kind of pivotal in the middle with communications and the cascading of communications. And I think we've heard a lot about accidental managers, which you picked up on. People are getting promoted perhaps on past achievements rather than on other skills that they need. What in your eyes would be the single most important thing that, say, organizations could do to improve, if you like, the experience that line managers then relay onto their kind of direct reports to make this better, to make communication more seamless, perhaps? Is it training?
So training's part of it. Of course it is. But I think in many organizations, there is a negative connotation wrongly with training, particularly when we use words like mandatory, which can have very negative perceptions. So I think training is an important part of it and providing the skills, but it needs to be, any kind of training and upskilling needs to be absolutely relevant and contextual. Like I was saying, how a leader or a manager in a financial services company is going to brief their team versus how a shift supervisor is going to brief their team at the start of a factory shift are totally different. And those kinds of organizations and the kinds of skills that those respective people will need in order to make it work, I think, are quite different. I think the other challenge really is that we expect a lot from managers. We're expecting them to do their day job. We're expecting them to manage people. We're expecting them to deliver all of these communications, and not just deliver them, although I think that's what happens a lot, but deliver them with context and with more relevance, because that's the value that the line manager should bring. But then on top of that, there is also an expectation in many organizations for them to be leading onboarding processes for new hires, recruitment, the sort of ongoing HR sort of outsourcing of certain elements to technology to provide more of a self-service, which is great as a concept, but it's yet more things that the manager needs to be able to look after. And I think what organizations really need to do is provide a lot more clarity of what they should be prioritizing. And in my view, the priority, I think that line managers are, when used really effectively, probably one of the most effective communication channels that we have available to us within organizations, because they have that knowledge of you as a person. I mean, if you think about my background is in marketing and in brand, and the way in which we communicate, or we should communicate to employees, shouldn't necessarily be any different. So in kind of marketing world, communication is about encouraging consumers to buy into a product. And internally, it should be about encouraging employees to buy into a career. And the way in which they do that in marketing world, as you will know, is about making sure that we are focusing on behaviors, and that we're focusing on an understanding of that human being as an individual, what is unique to them, so that we can provide them with the equivalent of a face-to-face or a one-to-one conversation with someone that they know and trust. And that's the line manager in the world of work. And they are not currently and I'm painting with a broad brush, across hundreds of organizations, but the sense that I get from the data and from anecdotal conversations is that there isn't the space and the time and the effort put into setting them up for success in that role. And I don't think that is being done as effectively as it could be. But as you can see from the data, there is a massive gap there, but no one seems to be taking ownership of whose job it is to fix it. And I think that's part of the challenge we have.
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned the word trust, which seems to be a big word that seems to be coming up more and more in these conversations. Could you expand a little bit more about that? How big an issue is it, a lack of trust, shall I say?
There's not a huge amount in the report that I can connect to on data around trust, but there was a perceived risk in there around leadership trust, a risk of leadership trust going down, which we know there was a huge spike in reduction in leadership trust when it comes to change communication, when organizations communicate high volumes. Shock horror, over communicating isn't always best. I think trust really comes down to a few key things from my perspective. When it comes to communication and driving change within an organization, I won't go into the role of a leader and the importance of credibility and vulnerability and those kinds of things in terms of behavior and being a genuine person that people can buy into and trust, because I think that's obviously massively important, but probably a podcast in itself on that. But I think when it comes to helping to encourage trust within an organization, it's about striking the right balance between clarity and openness and honesty and transparency around whatever change is going on and why, and what it means for you as an individual, versus making sure that you are providing a filtered version of that story that means it's as relevant as it can be for the audience that you're communicating with, but not running the risk of them feeling like they're not getting the full picture. That's the challenge when it comes to trust in communications, because people are complaining about being overloaded with information and at risk of burnout. So we're saying, well, let's simplify the communication. But if you don't tell everybody everything, then is there a sense that you're holding something back? And I think that is it's a really tricky balance to strike. And I think that's where it comes down to the credibility and the trust in the individual leaders and the line managers to be able to make that call. That trust comes through in the way that they communicate.
Absolutely. And Chris, can you talk a little bit perhaps about communication channels? Because that's always an important one, isn't it? When you talk about being overloaded with or bombarded with communication, what have we seen in the report? What are your clients telling you? What do employees prefer? Or is it difficult, obviously, to generalize?
What did come out of the report was the impacts that not just having a communication strategy, of which channels and message and cadence and measurement are all parts of that strategy, but actually to the impact that having a strategy and socializing it and sharing it with your peers and sharing it with leaders, the impact that has. We saw that has an impact on engagement. So organizations who have got a well-socialized communication strategy are up to 3.5 times as likely to see an improvement in engagement scores. So the channels are part of a strategy. As part of the report, we've created a series of segments which represent different types of, sort of, for want of a better word, persona groups based on their ability to respond to risk. And at the end of the report, because we wanted it to be very practical and tangible, there are a series of tailored recommendations for kind of quick wins and longer term solutions based on where you're at within your organization and what access you have to data and channels and so on and so forth, you should really focus on. But what we did find from the channel piece, and there's a whole section in the report about satisfaction of channels, is that the majority of respondents were not happy with their ability to personalize using the current channel mix. So if we think about the importance of communication with context, and just going back to the line manager conversation around the importance of that sort of personalized relevance, I think a few years ago we were hoping that conversation was going to be replaced by data-driven technology and apps, and to an extent that has, and there are some fantastic platforms out there that can do this, but they're only as good as the content that is provided and the data that sits in the background to try and make it as personal and relevant as possible. So what we've seen is a shift towards really stripping back the number of channels that the organizations are using, that they're focusing much more on, or starting to want to focus much more on, thinking about different persona groups and what are the desired outcomes, rather than just making sure that you've got channels to tell everybody about stuff. It's more intentional than that, and thinking about how the channels that you use need to make sure that they are fit for purpose. And we actually had a score connected to this in the report around organisational agility. So the ability to personalize, the ability to be reactive, the ability to reach difficult to reach people. So all of those kinds of things are almost a prerequisite for the communications. But I think what tends to happen is this sort of over communication. If we're concerned, or if the engagement statistics are low on an employee app, then there tends to be this desire to just send more emails and put more team stuff in channels and provide more line manager toolkits and create more stuff. And I think the reality is that's not necessarily going to be fixing the problem. Understanding what you're trying to achieve and linking your channel usage and your chat and your communication strategy to your business strategy and to your people strategy, it should all come off those aspects. So in terms of a business strategy, will be focused on, and I'm kind of overly simplifying the complexities of these things, but really looking to drive growth and performance through a setup of behaviors and skills. And the job of the communicators are to make sure that there is that strategic alignment, but also that there's the sense of culture and the right kind of behaviors and values that are going to drive that strategy forward. So the channels that organizations use should reflect the nature of their people, who they are, and how they like to absorb information, and what they're trying to achieve as a business. I mean, on a general note, we have seen, which won't be a huge surprise, that there's sort of interest in the ways in which employees like to absorb content. And again, I'm painting with a broad brush, but it reflects the consumer world. So short form video, people are used to scrolling and liking, and the social media world is very short, sharp bits of information, bite size, very relevant, very personal, using storytelling as well to get some of those ideas across in a way that really brings things to life, particularly when we think about things like benefits communications, which in many organizations tend to be very focused on the end date for enrollment and potentially some new benefits that are available, rather than actually thinking about how do we bring these benefits to life in a meaningful way by telling real employee stories about how people have really benefited from these things. I think there's a big shift towards, and things like TikTok show those examples where you're not seeing a polished, curated corporate message. You're seeing someone to video doing a fairly quick, off the cuff, what feels like a very down to earth, possibly not, message. But the idea being that it feels of the moment, it feels relevant, and it's coming from their perspective. And I think that there's a shift in employee communications to be as relevant as it possibly can be to employees as individuals, using those kind of techniques of storytelling and using more informal language and more informal tone and short, sharp, bite-sized information.
Yeah, lots there, Chris. In terms of the snackable content, the bite-sized content, is there anything, what's resonating at the moment with employees? Is video still a favorite?
Video is still a favorite. So yes, it absolutely is. Email is one of those ones that we get sort of every year that seems to be used, but not necessarily because it's popular, just because it's the channel that everybody has. But long form emails are a no-no. So try and keep them short and simple. Make sure that they are just going to the people that it's relevant for, and that there's a clear call to action, I think is really key for emails, but for everything. What we did also see though, is that interestingly, in a world of technology and us being constantly connected, the channels and the communication styles that the respondents seem to really value were face-to-face meetings. So face-to-face town halls, management round tables, opportunities to interact with other human beings through a conversation. And that seemed to be where, at the moment, seems to be the most popular form of interacting and where you can get your information from.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris. And would you just mind just explaining persona groups just a little bit more, if you don't mind, just for our listeners? And I'd also be interested to just learn a little bit more about persona groups and how they work, how they're kind of put together.
Persona groups are a way of breaking down an audience or a workforce into segments that will help to ensure that your communications are more relevant. Now, the kind of basic versions of that are location, role, job level, length of tenure, things like that. So you can make sure that you are, I don't know, if you're in a law firm, for example, you might want to not necessarily separate entirely, but have a slightly nuanced message for business services versus the legal side of the house, for example. But that's the kind of the base level of these things. There are obviously within that, if I use a marketing example, I don't know if you've ever been on Google and had a look at what Google knows about you in terms of your persona, or has made an assumption about who you are. It's probably worth having a look at. But, Google, for example, knows that I'm in my mid-40s. I've got kids who are daughters. I'm interested in pizza ovens. I'm probably oversharing. There's too much, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are other things about, me saying, "Hi, I'm Chris. This is my job level and I'm based in London." That doesn't define me as an employee, and it doesn't define me as a human. There are other things that we can think about, other metrics that we can think about in order to ensure that messages resonate more effectively. So, for example, it may well be that, we might want to connect employees that we know that have, I think I used the example earlier, like caring responsibilities, or people who have enrolled in a particular benefit. We might want to think about employees who have recently come into the organization through a merger, and they'll be in a very different world. They might even not necessarily be familiar with some of the jargon and terminology that your organization uses because they are new to the business. I think the other area that is particularly topical and relevant, and whether you believe in sort of change curves and things like that or not, but kind of the openness to change. So when we're looking at things like AI adoption and we're developing personas, you'll look at things like the people who are absolutely bought in and are going to be the champions of this change. There are going to be the people who are perhaps a bit on the fence. There are the ones who are a bit afraid of AI because they're worried about the impact that it's going to have on their job and on their career. And I think it's really important about thinking, how is this message going to be received by different types of people within the organization, not just their role and their location, but actually the different types of people, their level of behavior, and how do we feel that they are going to respond to this change or to this communication? And personas can be a really helpful way, as long as you don't overcomplicate it, because otherwise the data becomes a bit of a nightmare. But as long as you can create some sort of really meaningful groupings that will enable your message to get as much cut through as it possibly can.
Perfect. Thanks for explaining that, Chris. Appreciate that. And as we move on towards kind of top tips, if you like, takeaways, perhaps lessons learned from the survey findings, just before we do that, obviously you've touched on it, but could you just talk a little bit about human-centric communication and personalization and why it's so critical and important and fundamental?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was delighted that we added in a few questions about this in the report and the survey this year. Human-centric communication covers a lot of things, but essentially it's about really communicating in a way that is reflective of a conversation, and it feels human, it feels genuine, it's easy to understand. It's kind of the opposite of the kind of, now that's almost become a bit of a caricature of itself, the sort of corporate communication, which is very impersonal, uses long, complicated words, is a lot longer than it needs to be. There isn't particularly sort of much clarity in terms of what it is. So, human-centric communications at its base is about making sure that you're being absolutely targeted in terms of who you're talking to. You're making it really simple. You're focusing it on what's in it for them, and you are using tone of voice and language to reflect the brand of your organization. So that might be, light and humorous, or proudly British, or proudly American, or it might be, reflective of your values as an organization, and making sure that you're using the right kind of words to connect to that. So we did a big piece. There's a couple of bits in there. One is that understanding of audience, which is really important. We've spoken a little bit about that in terms of persona groups. And the other side of things is about the way in which you communicate, the imagery that you use, the tone, the language that you use. And we saw some really interesting statistics in the report about the impact that language and tone of voice has on reducing perceived risk. And it was quite significant. So we saw people who were using a less corporate and a more human tone, saw reductions in perceived employee burnout, reductions in increased leadership trust as a result of the way in which we communicate as well. So that human-centric piece is around not just making sure that you're communicating to inform, but you're communicating to make a connection with people and drive a desired outcome or a desired behavioral outcome. That's what human-centered comms is about.
Yeah, the need for that human, authentic connection. Tone of voice came up in the report. I was very interested just to read about that, actually. And Chris, I mean, we're coming to the end. It's been a really interesting conversation. Really appreciate your time. I mean, we always like to sort of end with kind of, let's call them top takeaways, best pieces of advice for our listeners. I'm sure that they've been, obviously they can go away and read the report as well to get the full picture. But what would you say? What's your parting message to them today?
Yeah, well, firstly, do download and read the report and have a look at the tips that we have in there towards the end of the report itself. But I think what really came out for me as being the key elements is the importance that change capability is not going away anytime soon. And making sure that you've got those skills within your function and within your organization so that we're better able to deal with change rather than looking at change as programs that have a specified endpoint, I think is an important shift in behavior and mindset that we need to focus on. The manager piece, I think, is absolutely important, is absolutely critical. So the importance of equipping managers with the right tools and the right time and a systematic and intentional way to ensure that they're as effective a channel as possible. I think sharpening segmentation, we saw in the report that very low numbers of organizations are currently really thinking about how do they segment and tailor their audience groups. And I'm aware that that's something that's not always possible because the data isn't always there, or you might not necessarily have access to the right kinds of channels or technology, but even small positive moves in the right direction to make things a little bit more targeted is really key. I think the visibility of having a communication strategy and having it shared is incredibly important, and how that links to your people strategy and to your business strategy. I've been talking to many people over the last few days around the importance of connecting the dots between various different elements of the employee experience. This report started out as predominantly for the internal communications function. However, over the years, it's evolved and is now very much for people that both in the world of communications, but also in HR. Yet, in many organizations, those two areas do not collaborate as closely as they could. Communicators are trying to get leadership messages out and messages around strategy and ambition and behaviors without necessarily thinking about how they can connect that to total reward communications or benefits enrollment conversations or onboarding, all of those elements which are already moments that exist within the employee experience, that the employee doesn't differentiate between these things from a subject perspective. It's just their experience of being an employee within that organization. So I think having that strategy and having it shared so that we're able to connect the dots is going to have a massive impact. The other piece that's come up a lot was around the ability to influence, and influence can only happen when you are measuring impact, in my view. A lot of leaders are still asking for communicators. They're asking for metrics more focused on output, like how many people clicked on this email, how many people looked at this video. And that's fine, but it's still very surface when it comes to the impacts that effective communication can have. So the organizations that are really doing well in this space are the ones that are focusing communication on, or measurement rather, on impact on business outcomes, and really making that link. And then the last point, and I know we've spoken about it a little bit, but the importance of just keeping it human when it comes to communication in this world where we've got AI coming through, shifting expectations, people in hybrid work and are increasingly disconnected. Technology is an incredible enabler, but we are human beings first, and we're emotional creatures. We pick up on the non-verbal cues. We're designed to do that, and we're also designed to understand through storytelling. So that sort of connection to the human being, I think, will become more important than ever, and will be the sort of the broad area where the core skills for employees of the future will be focused, I believe.
I think that's the perfect place to end, Chris, on that human note. We are human beings indeed. So thank you so much for your time and talking to us about the State of the Sector Employee Comms Report. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Luca. It's been a pleasure to be part of it.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Chris. You'll be able to download your copy of the report and discover lots of practical tips to help you address the people readiness gap. The Navigating Risk podcast is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Do join us next time. Thanks for listening.